Hi, my name is Jessie Susanna Carnat, and I run a business called Money Witch. This is my YouTube channel. Thanks for joining us today. I'm in Los Angeles just for 24 hours, and one of the wonderful things I got to do while I was here is hang out with my friend. We decided it's been about 5 years. My friend Sid, also known as Stephanie Sid Yang, of so many prolific projects: Blue Jaguar Healing Arts, Three-Legged Crow, and Release Bulimia, which is a part of Blue Jaguar Healing Arts.
Yeah.
I'm going to turn it over to you to kind of introduce yourself and what you do and where we could find you on the interwebs.
Cool. Thank you. Welcome. Hi.
So this is Spider.
And this
also,
is Spider.
the star of the show.
She really wanted to be a part of the video.
Yes.
I'm Sid. I'm in LA. I'm a mixed race queer healer and do a lot of work with queer folks and folks of color around transitions and bodies and healing trauma, specifically around self-harm and eating disorders, and looking at it from an energetic and emotional perspective. And so working with healing modalities, energetic modalities, engaged inquiry, looking at what is the relationship between our body and the way we move through the world, and how do we actually access more joy and liberation in our day-to-day life and in our experience of our bodies. So
thank you for doing that.
You're welcome. It's hard work. And it's these are practices that over the years that I've developed and learned and was taught that helped me survive and thrive and overcome a lot of histories of trauma and body trauma and eating disorders. And so it's a gift to be able to share it out, and it's always a journey. I'm always learning. Yeah.
And where can we find you on the internet?
Yes, that piece. So the easiest way to find me on the internet is my website, and it's bluejaguarlove, LOVE.com. On Instagram, I'm pretty active there. You can find me. I have 3 places, 3 portals, if you will. At Blue Jaguar Love, at Three-Legged Crow Healing, and at Release Bulimia.
And what is your Three-Legged Crow project? Because this is my favorite.
Yeah, Three-Legged Crow is where I make medicine and plant-based medicine, earth-based medicine. I make candles. I make bird essences. I do bird medicine work for spiritual and personal growth. So it's a lot of fun, and there's some DIY online classes there. I have a book that you can find there.
You should definitely buy it. It's really good.
I do a lot of readings. I do bird channeling readings, which are totally awesome.
They are totally awesome.
Super fun.
You should definitely buy Sid's bird medicine book and all bird medicine essences and get a reading, and then go to all of your businesses. Just support them all because they're awesome.
And they all work together. And it's like, what are the tools that we have in order to do the deep healing emotional work, which can be really exhausting, and where's the fun in that? And so bringing it all together.
Cool. Yeah. Speaking of fun, we've been talking about grief all morning. So
super fun.
Super fun. But that was kind of the point, right? Like, how actually could you reframe grief in a way that isn't. Are there any other stories that aren't so completely devastating around grief, right? And therefore, like, how do we integrate it into our lives and still be like functioning and use grief, the tool of grief, right? In order to access like deeper liberation and joy within ourselves. So since we're generally talking about money, I want to give a little bit of a money framework first, which is that the reason I feel like this is relevant in terms of a financial conversation or in terms of healing your finances is in my Heal Your Finances workshop, the framework is essentially like, what are different emotional and spiritual blocks that are preventing you from getting from where you are now to where you want to be, and the idea is like, if it was simple or there weren't blocks from getting like where you are now to where you want to be, like you would just probably already be there, right? That would be what was happening. So we're going to just, assume that there's some things blocking your way. Some of those things are, tangible, systemic. Some of them are emotional, spiritual. So, and the emotional spiritual is like what you have control over, essentially. One of those things can be unhealed grief. So unhealed grief takes up a lot of space in your life, right? And it takes up a lot of space in your cognitive process. It takes up a lot of space in your physical process. We were talking about that, right? The way that it manifests in like depression, overwhelm, anger, frustration, and the way that all of those things are things that we physically act out and take up a lot of like just hours in our life. And that process of not having closure around grief and having grief that's kind of like even maybe closed but unprocessed. Like, it's more like scabbed over or, something like that rather than actually like fully healed. That prevents us from being as, liberated, joyful, and empowered as we can be. And that really, like, being in that space of liberation and power is so intricately interwoven with our finances. So that's why I want to talk about it, why we think it's relevant. And I wanted to hand it over to you to talk because I know you've been thinking and living a lot about grief and just, like coming up with some ideas about how to go more deeply into the story of grief in a way that we can integrate it into our lives and that you can use it as a tool for yourself, but also for clients.
Yeah. That's a lot. And I think it's
Tell us now how to do it.
Grief will fix all your problems.
Yes.
Maybe not actually. But the piece with grief, which I'm just sitting with so much, is that the last 6-7 months for me is life being like, oh, you want some more loss? Here. You want a little bit more? Oh, you haven't grieved enough. Here you go. Oh, you're not flat on the floor yet? Here's a little bit more grief. And so I've been living that in this body, and this body that already holds so much grief, from past grief, ancestral grief, uh, environmental grief. Like it's a lot of what I carry, and that's a lot of that medicine that's inside me. So to be thrown a dose of it again was like, oh, what do I do? There's a part of me that was just like, I can just surrender and just be like, I give up. Or it can be like, can I develop a different relationship to grief so it actually doesn't take me out into ways where I just end up in my trauma response and in a spiral, right? Of I'm not good enough, like I did something wrong, I'm messing up, I'm missing something, everybody else has it figured out and I don't. I can go on. I'm sure you have your own dialogue and narrative that can be added to that, but I'm like, I don't want to live in that spin over and over and over again. So I'm like, how do I develop a different relationship? And so that's a lot of my practice is what is my relationship to that emotion? And grief is such a tricky and complex and layered and difficult emotion. And we're not oftentimes taught in our families and in our cultures how to really honor grief as an emotion that all of us feel. The earth feels it, animals feel it, spider feels it, I feel it, you feel it. Like we all feel grief. The trees feel it, right? So it's not something that we did wrong or we're not doing right because we're feeling more of it. It's just we're actually alive.
It's normal. Right. Because with alive, it's like there's life and then there's death. That's a part of life. Yeah. Right.
And it's those cycles. And so how do we cycle in the mini cycles of life and death and rebirth and the big macro cycles of life and death and rebirth? And so I like to think about this idea, and something you talked about earlier today when we were talking about grief is this idea of like completeness or completion or closure, right? And so when we think about grief, like what does it mean to have closure around grief or around a loss? What does it mean to have completeness? And how do we get there, right? Because sometimes a loss happens that makes no sense. That's out of the blue, whether it's a breakup or a sudden death or a loss of a job. There's a lot of things that can happen, right? So we may feel like how can we ever get closure or completeness in that?
Well, because when it's sudden, there's a shock element, right?
Exactly.
Like we go into shock,
right?
And then being in shock prevents us from grieving, essentially, like moving through it. And then because of the structures of our lives and our emotional tools, like a lot of time that shock takes up so much space. Healing from the shock takes up so much space that the actual like grief process that needs to happen after that kind of doesn't, there's not even space for that.
Right. Or we didn't even realize it was grief because it's something that happened when we were, say, 3 years old, right? And so it becomes that unresolved trauma or the unrecognized or unexperienced trauma that you were talking about that really impacts our relationship to money, right? Our relationship to people, our relationships to survival. Um, and so I love this idea of like, what does that mean to be complete? And so I can share a story of how I experienced this. Is earlier this year, one of the losses. Uh, I had the gift and the privilege and the invitation of a dear friend of mine who had been diagnosed with stage 4 cancer really suddenly at the end of last year, with no diagnosis before that. So it was very, very sudden. There was a lot of shock. There was a lot of what just happened. And to be able to be with her for the next 3 months of her life. And she passed away. And during that time, being able to be that close to a transition and a transformation, not just in her own body, but in our relationship, in her family relationship, in the larger construct of who we are in community, because she was an artist who I was very much in community with. Um, and so all those changes were happening. And so I was able to show up, be in relationship, and allow that as those exterior relationships and constructs were shifting, be able to say, what do I need here to be complete, right? Is there something I need to say? Is there something I need to do? Is there something I need to receive? Is there something I need to request? So asking myself those questions, what is that unmet need in this relationship? Because so much of grief is about an unmet need.
Yes.
Right? Whatever that is, an unmet need around love, an unmet need around money, an unmet need around shelter, around safety, around feeling safe. We can go on. And so I came from that place of what is that unmet need in my relationship to this friend, right? And I don't always do that with our friends because like, oh, they're always there. I don't always think about like what's that unmet need. I'm thinking, those subconsciously or unconsciously, it's just going to get met as we continue our relationship. But here I had a timeline, right? A deadline. And so it invited me in to have different conversations with her. And as I sat with her, being able to say and request and sit with and work with her transition in a different way. And by the end, when I sat with her the night before she died, I had this deep sense of there's a completeness here, right? And at this time, she was in hospice care and she couldn't speak and she couldn't respond. But there was an understanding. I'm like, wow, there was things that she was able to say to me and had said over the month before, and things that I was able to say and share and do and be in relationship around. That it felt complete, and I've never had that moment before with somebody. Um, whether it was even in relationships and breakups, I haven't had that sense of completeness in that moment of the separation or the loss. And that's not to say I didn't grieve and I don't grieve her loss. I do, because the grief as an emotion is there, because there's a transition, there's a change. I'm still reforming and reshaping my body and my life without her in it physically here. But because that completion is there, there was an ease in how I entered into the grief. And I don't feel like it knocked me out from under, like knocked my ankles out or knees out, whatever the saying is, from beneath me, in ways that I felt that way in other instances of grief. And so like, I think of that experience with that friend and how when we talk about um, grief as completion, and you were talking about like how do we get closure in our experience of feeling and being in our grief, like I'm really curious about like how that shifts our relationship to money, because that money is so much connected to our relationship to having our needs met. Right?
Yes. And I want to talk about that in one second, but I want to just highlight something. We don't necessarily need to go in it, but just sort of highlight the idea of this idea of like, what if grief is not viewed as loss, like, or this kind of binary idea of like there's life and there's death, or there's like having and then there's loss, but it's just just a change, right? Like there is a change. which doesn't mean that your nervous system isn't experiencing loss of something that potentially, a person that you're, or an animal, or what that you're attached to and used to having. Your kind of nervous system has a certain relationship with it. So your nervous system is having a relationship with, you know, I don't know, maybe it doesn't even have to be loss, right? Like, but change, right? So the idea of exploring, kind of like liberating ourselves from this really binary idea of like loss and having, and to just be like, it's just change, and change and shift is like inevitable. But yes, going back to this idea about getting your needs met and finances, I was discussing earlier. Well, number one, I think like the first thing that's coming out of that for me is, yeah, how much of our cognitive process, emotional process, spiritual process are we spending, kind of ruminating, for lack of a better word, on, our unmet needs, right? On even just a subconscious, unconscious level. And so therefore, if some of those needs are getting met, or if we're releasing that those needs are not going to get met in the way that we expected, needed,
from who we wanted,
yes, or
from
yes, or from who we wanted it from, when some of that either like closure, yeah, just closure or completion is created, like the way that it really does free up this space. But something that was coming up for me is around, that I see with clients a lot, is this idea of financial maturity, and that maturity kind of in general, is often linked to grief, or immaturity is sort of linked to unhealed grief. I have experienced that a lot in my own life, kind of being like ways in which I was like struggling to mature. I really had to go back and be like, oh, what is it? There's these parts of me that are kind of like stuck or splintered off, and due to different experiences, and I need to sort of like bring them up to speed with the rest of us. But this idea of, financial maturity specifically is often linked to the idea of, like, or resistance to financial maturity. I feel like is often linked to the idea of not like having to let go of the idea, even if you know on a conscious level, like it can't happen, but of getting your need met, by the person you wanted, in the time that you wanted,
in the form that you
in the
wanted.
form that you wanted and needed. Do you know? A lot of times needed, right? Because, if we're talking about experiences, especially in like childhood, youth, around resources, and not having certain needs met, or not being emotionally supported, or in our process around having like a lack of financial resources, etc., then, that's like, that's an actual need that's not getting met. And what, as long as we're carrying that unmet need, there is, I think it's paired with this hope on some subconscious level that somehow, you know, that part of us will get that particular need met, or want met, by the particular person in the particular way that we wanted, even though it's impossible. It's literally impossible, because even if that were to happen now, it couldn't happen in that moment at the time that we needed it. And so I think there's something that's like sad about, we have to like sort of release a hope, like release hope in a way, in order to fully let go of, and like move forward in having closure around kind of grieving, and it's difficult to release that hope. There's a lot of grief in releasing that hope, and it's often a child part of ourselves that we actually have to get to give up the hope. And that's like
that's hard.
That's a real wrestling act, and it requires a lot of like active reparenting work, which is another video worth, basically.
A whole other series.
Reparenting yourself around, unhealed grief.
Yeah, I feel like there's so much there, and in that is just with the, not just the releasing of that hope, or that longing, right? But in realizing in that, as we complete with that grief, that one, we haven't done anything wrong, right? We didn't do anything wrong then. We didn't do anything wrong now. Again, this is a part of human existence. It's a part of life. It's a part of natural cycles. And at the same time, grief is that mm, it's like it's a that indicator that's like, hey, here's where you're stuck. Here's where this is hard. Here's where this is feeling sticky. Or here's where that hope is distorting your experience in the present day, right? Whether it's with yourself or in relationship to others or in relationship to money. And so, how do we create spaciousness to kind of open up that relationship and be like, oh, okay, grief, I see you. I see you in this form over here as anger. I see you in this form over here as, what did we say? Like depression,
overwhelm,
checking out, disappearing, right? Or everything's fine, right? Pretending like everything's fine, putting on masks. But we need that spaciousness. And so, is there spaciousness in grief, right? Is there spaciousness in our relationship to grief, or are we constantly fighting it in combat with it? Or are we having that spaciousness of that breath? And how do we breathe into it? Because a breath has a beginning and an end, and then a beginning and an end. And if our grief, the waves of grief that we experience, right? Not the larger big G grief that exists in our body and exists in the world, but our experience of the moments of grief. Can we have a beginning of that experience and a completion of it? And so that is what I find can create some of that spaciousness of how do we be in the grief in that moment, let it rise, let it fall, because it will fall, it will pass, it will move through. And can we trust that?
And there's a fear of pain, right? Because it's so often physically painful, right? And then I agree, or have had like a very visceral experience in last year, 2017, in just being like, I have to just feel this really. And so much of the year was literally just spent like laying in bed, feeling waves of physical pain and just being like, I can get through this. And, but I think that there is a fear for people that they won't, they'll hit a wall and then there's some sort of like self-harm or, like they just can't, they don't have the coping skills, to feel that level of pain.
Right. And I think that's real. Like, and that's really real. And there's a lot of relationships between self-harm, between eating disorders, which I work in, and ways that we emotionally can harm ourselves through not being able or taught or given invitations to be with our grief, right? What are the practices that our ancestors used? What were the practices that those who came before us used to hold and process and integrate this grief, right? Where did they find their spaciousness in order to move forward? How can we find it? Because it doesn't have to destroy us, even though it feels like it can, right? And so also not just being like, oh, okay, well, our ancestors did that. How do I access this information from behind, right, in the past? But also, who do we build our relationships with in the present who can hold our grief, who can do it collectively with us, and who teach us and remind us and partner with us that grief is not an individual phenomenon.
Well, and just sort of like building practices in general, building relationships in general that increase our emotional resilience, right? Absolutely. Because having that, like a higher tolerance for uncomfortable and painful emotional sensations is what allows us to kind of like go deeper in and feel more. And the feeling through it is what allows you to get through it. It's almost like, you have to just process all the content, digest all the content. So,
and be with the change. Like, and I think that's been a lesson in my spiritual and personal healing practice of, can I sit with the fact, the reality, the truth that everything has changed? That is the constant that we live in, that everything is changing and everything is changing. And so how do I get comfortable with that?
Yeah. I want to just give a tool because I think, it's a kind of bookends here a little bit. So in my workshop that I teach, well, the first thing I say is like, I'm going to talk about a lot of things like unhealed grief or, shame, etc. that are like, I'm going to talk about them very casually. And that's not to say, and like that the fact that there could be solutions very casually, not to say that any of it is easy or flippant or like, you should be able to do it or you should be able to do it fast or you should be able to do it successfully. Like could take an entire lifetime, etc. But that's just sort of the framing. So my idea for like a kind of Jesse Susanna's quick and dirty grief ritual, which is really just about making space, right? Like making space to experience it. So I sort of say there's like four pieces, and you kind of just have to like block out time and give your space to go through the four steps, and then it's sort of like repeat as necessary. So it's really like blocking out time to feel deeply into just the sadness, you know, and sad rather than, frustrated, angry, whatever. But I mean, and to notice those things too, but to just really allow yourself to be sad. To give yourself comfort. So it's like, feeling into it and then comforting yourself, um, and then allowing space for rest. Oh, no, no, no. I missed it. I was like, what's the fourth step? Okay. It's number two. Okay. One, feel into it. Give yourself space. So it's like an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, an afternoon, a day, to feel the sadness. Two, to do some sort of releasing, like a releasing ritual, whether that's, you're at the ocean and you want to like throw rocks in, or you're going to write something on paper and burn it, or you're going to bury something, or, whatever it is. So feeling into it, uh, doing some sort of releasing action or ritual,
Burning
then
is
giving
really good.
burning.
Burning stuff is really good.
Yeah. And then actively comforting yourself, and then rest. And to just do those four things. To like carve out space and to know you might need a whole day, you might need one day a week to do that in a period of like very active breathing. Right. You might need every day to do that. You might need to do it once a month. You might need to, do it once a year on an anniversary, but to really like go through those four steps and allow yourself to digest a little piece, right? But to know that it's not just about digesting. It's like the digesting, but then also the comforting, and that comfort is not rest. Comfort and rest are not the same thing. You need them both, So that's my quick and dirty grief ritual. I don't know if you have any thoughts or
No,
comments.
I love that. I think the one thing I've also noticed is sometimes the grief to feel into it is so terrifying, um, that we may not, because of the trauma we carry in our body, maybe doing that on your own may not be the best thing or the right thing for you. And so there's like, I love the four steps, and how do you make them yours? How do you make them work for you? Do you invite somebody in to witness, to hold, to be with you, in that process?
Or like a check-in, to
exactly.
let somebody know I'm gonna do this, and can you check in with me, or come in, stick your head in once an hour, or come with me to the beach and or drive me and pick me up, or
what are those? How are we requesting support as well?
I think, I mean, I know you're talking about specifically about support, but what was coming up for me is sort of like, how do we establish safety, right? So sort of like before we create the whole thing, what do we need to do to make it safe for ourselves, including, having a talk. I really am big into like the different parts of yourself, having a talk with the different parts of yourself to sort of say like, we're going to do this. It's safe. Like we're in current time, we're in real time. This is a safe environment. So and so person's going to help us and check in on us. People care about us. Like, whatever it is that we need to sort of establish for ourselves to create either like physical safety, emotional safety, codependence, interdependence, safety, etc.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's the power in all of this is, also like why we come back to this word relationships. Like it's not just our relationship to money that we're talking about. It's our relationship to each other, our relationships to ourselves, our relationship to our emotions, our relationship to the change that we're undergoing. And how do we learn to and practice like leaning into those relationships and stepping into and giving ourselves permission to be in relationship, and to call on relationships. And I think that piece around like what do we need to feel safe? What do we need to feel grounded? What do we need to feel, spacious? Right? That what do I need in order to be able to fully release? Right? And what is that going to look like?
And letting yourself have it, no judgment. Just
exactly.
Like, what are your needs?
What are your needs?
Do what you can do to get them met. Because if you're fronting about your needs, we're not going to get anywhere, really, ultimately.
Yeah. And to think about if in that, part of what you need to release, where you are currently in your body and in your relationship to your body is a form of self-harm, then how can you do that and engage in that in a way that reduces the harm on yourself and on others? And so to think about, like, I feel like that's a really important piece. It's not like, no, you can't have that coping mechanism or that survival skill. Harm reduction is so critical. And so who holds that with you, holds those values, and can hold those conversations with you? I think that's really important.
I'm going to wrap up here because we're getting so long. We could talk forever.
I know.
Thank you so much for being in conversation today.
Thank you for inviting me and Spider today.